So, a major theme that has preoccupied us since the beginning of this course has been that of the transition from feudalism towards that of modern times. And in fact, we're locating colonial America itself as sort of caught in between both, periods in history, that is, between feudalism and modern times. So that's why it's been a constant theme in this course. And in fact, with the last argument in this topic, 18th century, we're making the case that when we look more closely at colonial culture, colonial politics, colonial beliefs, we see that many of them are moderns. Things like democratization, leveling effect, emphasizing the ordinary person, the commoner, starting to question monarchy, and being involved in consumerism. That's obviously a modern human activity. So this brings us to the necessity of looking at modern ideas and to see why they're so innovative and how they departed from older views that we could characterize as feudal, and why these Enlightenment thinkers would claim those older ideas as being outmoded, right, out of fashion. And the ideas that they'll put forth will basically give rise to a new way of thinking about the world. And this period, by the way, spans roughly 200 years in Europe, let's say between 1650 and 1850. But it's going to spill over to the Americas. And indeed, our founding fathers would be self-proclaimed children, if you will, or disciples of Enlightenment thought. They'd be heavily influenced by other well-known Enlightenment thinkers or Enlightenment philosophers and scientists. And, you're familiar with some of these famous thinkers like Isaac Newton, who was the father of modern physics, let's say John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, who made innovations in political philosophy and political theory, and so on and so forth. Philosophers just such as Rene Descartes, Immanuel Kant, David Hume, and many others. Okay, so it's a period of ferment in European intellectual history. And in fact, when you think about the term Enlightenment, you have to think of their ideas as illuminating, really, the intellectual world of Europe. Because let's recall, the medieval period was called the Dark Ages, right? And you see this period, between the Dark Ages and the Enlightenment period, known as the Renaissance, roughly between 1400 and 1600, where you see this resurgence in art, especially the production of art. And then that'll be followed by intellectual innovation. Now, even though scholars say it ends in, say, 1850s, that doesn't mean that today their ideas are outmoded. In fact, if you look at the list of ideas on this slide, many of them are still taken for granted today. But what happens during the period between 1650 and 1850 is that these ideas are not only innovated upon, but they began to enjoy currency, meaning they become accepted. And they're replacing the older way of looking at the world. All right, so we see first this idea of increasing secularism. And secularism basically refers to looking at the world, let's say, cause and effect in the world, in the external world, or even looking at human activity, human relations, without resorting or appealing to God, right? Or ideas of, let's say, the divine intervention, right? So when you look at the world in a secular way, again, you're not thinking religiously. Now, this did not mean that Enlightenment thinkers were atheists. In fact, many of them were actually devout Christians, but they found a way to think about, let's say, the world or human activity, the social realms, without thinking about God as, if you will, the prime mover, right? That's to say, God as this sort of, puppeteer, right, that controls everything. Rather, they're thinking in secular terms again, non-religious ways of thinking. Now, it deserves to mention here that in the beginning of the modern period, in the early modern period, many people who began to put forth secular ideas were brought before the Catholic court, right? The Inquisition is an example, right, where they'd be charged with heresy, and the punishment for that was pretty stark. You could be excommunicated, if not put to death. All you have to do is think about Galileo, brought before the inquisitors, right, charged with heresy. That's to say, coming up with explanations of, the heavenly bodies without resort to God. That's heresy, right, according to the Catholic court. And even though he urged them to look through the telescope that he made, they did not want to look at it, right, because it might disrupt their whole way of looking at the world. That's to say, the way these Catholic inquisitors who were charging Galileo with a crime. Okay, so secularism actually is quite bold back then, okay, to talk about things in a secular way. Now today, it's no longer controversial to resort to secularism, but we see it arising in the Enlightenment period, and again, to use our earlier phrase, it will gain currency. It will be considered eventually commonplace. Again, it'll take a while, but that will become the case. Now, related to secularism are human reason or human rationality, and even science, which is really an outgrowth of human rationality. So when you think about human reason, of course, you're thinking about not only things like logic, but also thinking about the world and using rationality to explain the world. And what is that opposed to? Thinking about it in irrational terms. That's to say, I'm resorting to, let's say, superstition or the supernatural, right? Believing in ghosts and spirits and all this stuff, right? Today we call that supernatural, or believing in superstition, like habits that you have to do, right? In order for things to work out, right? Well, according to Enlightenment thinkers, that's irrational. You have to be rational. We are equipped, human beings that is, are equipped with reason. This is exactly what separated us from the animals, they explained. And therefore, we have to use our rational capacities when we think about the world. And perhaps the best example of this is when we are engaged with scientific methods. So this brings us to modern science, right? And we're all familiar with the scientific method. It involves hypothesis, it involves experimentation and testing, and finally, depending on your experimentation and testing, you come up with theories and finally a scientific law. And what's quite incredible here, I just talked about Isaac Newton, right, who came up with modern ideas of gravity and so forth, and invented calculus, right? Using math, that's another thing that's considered, important, right? Mathematical models to explain the world. And there's, of course, a close relation with that and science, the scientific method. So what's incredible about this is the explanatory success of science. Back then, when you had people like Newton and other scientists that followed Newton, especially in the world of physics, but also in the world of medicine and other areas of science, biology, it was quite impressive back then how they could explain the world, right? Again, making no um, recourse or no appeals to God, right? You're putting forth mathematical models that explain the world, and not only that, there's this built-in predictive power that's very impressive, right? The idea that you could predict events in the future through mathematical models. For example, an eclipse, or the revolution of planets around the sun. Like, you could predict how long that takes, and it's proven through science. So it should be obvious how science and human reason, of course, are considered innovation or step forward from older ways of thinking. Before modern science, if you had something like an earthquake or an eclipse, really scared you. Why? Because you thought of it, or you analyzed it in irrational terms or religious terms, right? People would make claims that the gods are angry, for example, or that it was the end of the world. Now scientists come along and say that's not the case. Here's our explanation, and in fact, they'll be able to predict the next eclipse. So the predictive power and the explanatory success of the scientific enterprise, the way they explain cause and effect in the world through math, through this mechanistic system, is very impressive. And needless to say, Sir Isaac Newton's model actually will be the paradigm, to use our term, until Einstein comes along, really. And even today, we still study Newton, right? We just find a way to reconcile Newtonian physics with Einsteinian, if you will, physics. Okay, so that brings us to modern ideas about government. So yes, there were Enlightenment political philosophers, political theorists, political thinkers who began to recast or rethink the relationship between the ruler and the ruled. And needs to say, it was taken for granted before the Enlightenment thinkers that the rulers in history, throughout human history, were destined to do so or to be so by virtue of the fact that they often was explained, as a matter of fact, as they were ordained by God. Okay, this brings us to this idea called the belief in the divine right of kings, right? The divine right of kings. And by the way, our founding fathers, by 1776, will dispute that idea of divine right of kings. Now, divine right of kings means the divine God has ordained you to become a ruler, or perhaps an emperor, right? Depends on where you are in the world. So this is going to be challenged, this idea that there's this sovereign ruler who has complete authority over everyone, right? Even the control of life and death over people, his or her subjects, right? That's going to be questioned and displaced by newer ideas whereby more power will be given to the ruled. Okay? And all you have to do is think about the Constitution and the Declaration of our Independence, which are our founding, texts, if you will, our founding ideas, right? The intellectual bedrock of this country, right? And that's exactly what you do. You see a recasting of the relation of ruled versus ruler, to the point where the ruled have a lot to say about who should be the ruler. In fact, we should elect them, right? It should be the people who choose the ruler. And in turn, the ruler has certain obligations expected from the ruled. And if they fail to do so, well, they could no longer be the ruler, right? And we'll discuss this more when we discuss what's called social contract theory during the American Revolution. Okay, now other ideas arose, such as republicanism. Now, first of all, don't confuse this with modern day republicanism in current political discourse, like the Republican Party. It has nothing to do with this. Rather, it deals with a political arrangement called a republic, as opposed to a kingdom, let's say. A republic is different from a kingdom. In a republic, you reject the notion of monarchical rule, and it's replaced by the people who are the rulers. That's when you have a republic. All right, it's a very public thing, right? And hence you see a republic. The root of that in Latin is res publica, right? The public, right? So that's what republicanism is. It's a theory and practice that the best form of political governance should be one whereby the people rule. Now, democracy is something we talked about earlier, but in its more modern sense, it means rule by the people again. But it also involves ideas like majority rule, and certainly this notion of representative democracy, where again, the ruled will choose those rulers through elections, right? And then you have, of course, equality. And we talked about this in relation to that horizontal axis that I talked about in the process of democratization, where people are seeing each other more eye to eye. Now, we don't want to exaggerate how much equality there is in the 18th century in the colonies, let alone what Enlightenment thinkers thought about equality. Many of them naturally assumed, for example, that persons of color and women were not equal. Okay, but nonetheless, the Enlightenment thinkers were definitely steering away from this idea of inherited social status based on that feudal social ranking. Now, affiliated with the Enlightenment period is this overall belief in progress. And this is, again, something we take for granted that, progress happens in life or in history, that things get better in the future, right? But you have to imagine, for example, a peasant, especially a poor peasant living in the medieval times, let alone before the medieval times. That person did not believe in progress, at least in his or her lifetime on earth. You can't really witness progress. You don't see it happen. It doesn't happen to you because of your social ranking. Things don't seem to get better in the future, right? It's just static. It's a static view of the world. In fact, back then, you didn't really see history itself as the unfolding of progress. But what the Enlightenment thinkers will argue is this: if you accept the various articles of faith associated with Enlightenment thought, that is to say, thinking in more secular terms, privileging human rationality, resorting to science, and not to mention thinking about politics in terms of republicanism, democracy, and equality, right? Then the world will improve. Societies will improve. Human lives and human experience will get better in the future. Okay, so therefore, in fact, history itself, if again we adopt the beliefs of the Enlightenment period, becomes a story of progress. Things get better. Okay, so that's the belief in progress that's connected to the Enlightenment period. And this brings us to more specific British political ideas. Okay, and some of this we kind of discussed already. But the first one stated, and by the way, I should mention this, that these were innovative thoughts or beliefs that definitely emerged for the most part in England. Okay, the English prided themselves, as a matter of fact, as being key innovators in modern political thinking. that's not to say there's no other European influence like French, for example. Of course there is, but the British, you could notice this, are definitely innovators when it comes to modern political beliefs, such as, for example, the parliamentary system and a balanced constitution. Now, parliamentary system basically means, or it's the equivalent of what we call Congress. And Congress is a legislative institution, right? It creates the laws as opposed to the king, right? And maybe his advisors or a queen and her advisors legislating. No, in the parliamentary system, you have um, let's just call them, people who aren't monarchs, right? Non-monarchical people who legislate. And the balanced constitution, right? It's kind of like this arrangement between the monarch and, let's say, other people, whereby you acknowledge that there has to be a balance that prevents the monarch from attaining a preponderance of power. So it's an early form of checks and balances, which we'll talk about when we read the Constitution. Right? Now, the rule of law is interesting because think about this. In an emperor system or in a monarchical system, you have an actual person, a real person, who is the lawgiver, right? And that is the king or the queen or the emperor. But with rule of law, what you're doing is denying or rejecting the authority and legitimacy of that monarch or emperor, and you're replacing an actual person as ruler. You're replacing the actual or physical person with an abstraction, and that is to say you're replacing it with the law. The law is the ruler. Now, the law is not a person, obviously, right? But the law rules. The law does something that traditionally people do, that is to say, to rule. So you can look at this literally, the rule of law. Okay? So this began as an innovation again in England, whereby it was believed that, for example, no one was above the law because the law is the ruler, right? Even the monarch, even nobility and aristocracy, even the clergy. Now, again, we don't want to exaggerate the extent to which this was accepted. Of course, monarchs were still very, very, very powerful, but at least you see these ideas coming to the forefront and subject to vigorous debate, right? And today, in our country especially, we believe in the rule of law. And the final two there, again, please don't think about this in terms of contemporary political language or discourse. Republicanism, again, I already talked about this, has nothing to do with the Republican Party or the GOP. It has to do rather with a republic, right? Ruled by the people and not the monarch. Now, again, I said that was public. And the second one has to deal with more private beliefs of the individual. And that's modern day liberalism. And again, has nothing to do with, let's say, the Democratic Party. And the liberalism is this. It believes in the individual's religious, economic, political freedoms, which cannot be interfered from public institutions, namely the state. So, again, we accept this today, that the state has no business telling us what religion to believe in, what economic beliefs to follow and pursue, what political beliefs we should believe in and be involved in. The public has no say whatsoever in the private affairs of individuals. Okay, so this cluster of beliefs here, balanced constitution, republicanism, liberalism, is setting up, it should be obvious, it's setting up, as well as the Enlightenment beliefs, as well as things like consumerism, and so on and so forth, right? Equality, and social stratification where you see more fluidity, and the public sphere, all of this stuff is setting up the American Revolution, and how these ideas will be accepted as, if you will, the intellectual foundation of the American Republic that will rise by July 4th, 1776. So this ends our discussion of 18th century English colonies. And of course, our next topic will be colonial crisis leading to the American Revolution.